Russian criminal groups kidnapping and extorting soldiers and homeless people. Criminal group in Nova Scotia, Canada, busted for cocaine trafficking as well as extortion tied to Nova Scotia's lucrative lobster industry. All of that and much more on this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. This past week saw two separate criminal cases being brought in Russia against individuals who attempted to use the war in Ukraine for financial gain in schemes that involved extortion and fraud. One of these cases involves a group of criminals operating in the Chelyabinsk and Sverdlovsk regions of Russia who recruited desperate individuals, many of them homeless, to sign military contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense to fight in Ukraine, as well as providing them with temporary housing. The desperate recruits were forced to give members of the criminal group power of attorney over their bank cards, which allowed them to access their funds. Some women members of the criminal group even entered into sham marriages with the recruits in order to potentially receive payouts if they were injured or killed in combat in Ukraine. As part of this first case, 7 individuals between the ages of 25 and 50 were arrested and charged with large-scale fraud, of which the maximum penalty is 10 years imprisonment. Second case that was brought down this week in Russia relating to fraud against the military was brought to light with the arrest of a criminal group on November 22nd that allegedly kidnapped military veterans and extorted money from both military servicemen and their families. The suspects were arrested while traveling in a car. One of the arrested individuals was Ruslan Kartoyev, a member of the Baltalkhadze Brotherhood, which is considered a terrorist organization in Russia. The group hails from the Russian Republic of Ndrangheta in the North Caucasus. They are Sufi Muslims that follow the teachings of the 19th century Sufi figure Sheikh Baltalkhadze Belkharoev, whom they take their name from. Back in the 19th century, the group strongly opposed Tsarist rule, and this resistance would continue under the Soviets, and today they remain at odds with the Kremlin. Members of the group are thought to have been contracted by Ukraine to assassinate Russian General Igor Kirillov, which occurred in December of last year. Kirillov is the highest-ranking Russian official killed in the Ukrainian war. The Baltalkhadze Brotherhood is an extremely secretive organization with tens of thousands of members, each of them contributing 10% of their income to the Brotherhood. They are said to have contributed to the coffers of the Brotherhood by engaging in criminal activities such as gun smuggling. Despite tensions with Moscow, they are said to be strongly aligned with Ramzan Kadyrov, the leader of the Chechen Republic. These two cases are part of a growing pattern of financial crimes carried out against the Russian military establishment. Another case last month saw Vladimir Bardin, the leader of the Lubensky organized crime group, along with others, arrested for participating in a scheme against soldiers that was carried out in Russia's Sheremetyevo airport. They allegedly pointed them to taxi services, who then inflated the prices, threatening them with violence if they refused. They also allegedly offered alcohol and women to returning soldiers at the airport to distract them before stealing money from them. They have all been charged with extortion, theft, and fraud. One of the arrested suspects in this case, Alexei Kabachkin, is said to have requested to be sent to fight on the front lines in Ukraine, which is not surprising, as many Russian convicts, in order to expunge their sentences, offer to participate in Russia's war with Ukraine, with many of them being sent directly to the front lines, as they are viewed as expendable by the Russian military. But I feel like this trend of exploiting the Russian military establishment, as well as defrauding soldiers, will only continue as Russian military conscripts are paid very well to fight in Ukraine. And criminal groups see this as an opportunity to expand their coffers and steal the money that the state pays to these soldiers. I wouldn't be surprised at some point if we see ex-Russian soldiers engaging in these kinds of activities. As it is predicted, whenever the war in Ukraine ends, many of the Russian soldiers will have very little job prospects, and many of them will turn to organized criminal activity. This is very similar to what happened after the Soviet war in Afghanistan that led to the rise of organized crime in Russia in the 1990s. I feel like something similar like that could happen after the war in Ukraine ends, but for now these criminal groups are taking advantage of the ongoing war, stealing funds from soldiers, as well as recruiting homeless people to enlist in the war and then stealing the money they obtain from their contracts. The lawlessness continues to reign in Russia as these criminal groups look to exploit the Ukrainian war for financial gain. And this is very easy when you're dealing with a military establishment that's already rife with corruption. And this in turn makes it easier to exploit these loopholes and allow these criminal groups to reap the rewards passed on to soldiers by the Russian state. 28 people were arrested as part of a 2-year investigation by the Milan Financial Police in Italy's Guardia di Finanza, targeting a massive cocaine trafficking ring involving some of Italy's most powerful criminal organizations from Calabria, Lombardy, and Campania. As part of this investigation, 400 kilos of cocaine have been seized, and 27 million euros, or $31 million, were also seized. The cocaine trafficking ring trafficked approximately 3.5 tons of cocaine in container ships from South America to ports in Italy, as well as the port of Le Havre in France and the port of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. This ring was based in the northern Italian region of Lombardy and is also said to have had branches in Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, the United Kingdom, Colombia, and Brazil. The cocaine was placed into legitimate shipments without the owners of the containers aware that cocaine had been hidden. At the center of this cocaine ring, along with the Neapolitan Camorra, is the Barbaro clan of the Ndrangheta, particularly clan member Franco Barbaro. And I've talked about the Ndrangheta a few times before. They are now the most powerful mafia-like organization in Italy, and it's not even close. They're also considered one of, if not the most powerful criminal organizations in the entire world. They are arguably responsible for most of the cocaine entering Europe. Their annual revenue is said to exceed $50 billion. Pretty impressive considering they started from the poor southern Italian region of Calabria. But the Barbaros are one of the most powerful Ndrangheta clans. Their roots in Italian crime go all the way back to the late 19th century, as well as being based out of Calabria and the Lombardy region of northern Italy. Many of the clan's members for decades now have been based out of Australia, which has allowed the group to become an even more integral part of the international drug trade, where the price of cocaine in Australia is higher than anywhere else in the world. As part of this cocaine trafficking plot that was busted this week, it was determined that members of the Barbaro clan were in constant contact via encrypted messaging devices with Albanian brokers, as well as the suppliers of the cocaine in South America. Not surprising that Albanians are involved, as Albanian criminal groups have increasingly been collaborating with Italian groups, most prominently the Ndrangheta, in order to ship massive quantities of cocaine into Europe. Several of the individuals arrested as part of these raids were also Albanian. Also amongst the 28 arrested individuals is a Chinese citizen by the name of Shubo Yi, who is accused of laundering the ring's money through what is called Fei Xian, an underground banking system that allows for the transfer of the value of illicit funds without the physical movement of cash. And as I've pointed out many times before, Chinese money launderers are becoming the preferred method by which criminal groups all across the world launder their illicit funds, whether they be in Mexico or Europe. In Italy, Chinese criminals have also managed to corner the money laundering market, and here is another perfect illustration of that. 25 of the arrested suspects in this operation are currently detained, while 3 of them are under house arrest. And once again, I doubt this operation is going to really achieve much in the long term. This is just one of many operations that occurs so frequently. The authorities always tout these operations as huge successes, but criminal groups always regroup from these busts and very often expand beyond what they had been doing before. This is just a small little dent in the Ndrangheta's overall cocaine trafficking business. As I said before, it's $50 billion, and a $31 million seizure is nothing for them. As I mentioned earlier, too, the Camorra from the Neapolitan region of Italy are also said to be involved in this cocaine trafficking ring. It is said that in the Lombardy region of Italy, the Ndrangheta, the Camorra, and the Sicilian Cosa Nostra collaborate together as far as criminal activities go, and this has been dubbed the Lombard system, as these 3 Italian criminal organizations collaborate to traffic drugs, commit extortion, and infiltrate public contracts. It seems to me that the Lombard system had a role in this cocaine trafficking ring, despite it not being mentioned in any of the articles relating to this investigation. I also think it's interesting to see how involved Albanian criminals are in this operation. I just think their role in international cocaine trafficking is going to continue to increase. It can be argued that they're now on par with groups like the Ndrangheta, with many Albanian criminal groups controlling all different steps in the cocaine trade, many of them also being based in South America, where they directly source the cocaine. But this is just another operation to try to combat the international cocaine trade that will ultimately lead to nothing, as the demand for cocaine is at an all-time high, the output of cocaine is at an all-time high, and police and law enforcement all across the world can only do so much to combat this lucrative illicit industry that generates more than most Fortune 500 companies. 13-month-long investigation by Canada's RCMP, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and the Nova Scotia Department of Natural Resources, dubbed Project Hammer Time, culminated last week with the arrests of 4 men in southwest Nova Scotia on charges that include cocaine trafficking, arson, extortion, and illegal fishing and trading of lobsters. The past 18 months has seen multiple shootings, arson, and acts of intimidation carried out in the Clare region of Nova Scotia against lobster buyers who have refused to buy lobster from companies that purchase illegally caught lobster. The ringleader of this group is Eric Thibault, who was one of the 4 men arrested. Thibault is a longtime lobster dealer who has long been accused of illicit activities relating to the lobster industry. In 2005, he declared bankruptcy after he was unable to pay $1 million in unpaid income taxes he owed to the Canada Revenue Agency. In his bankruptcy records, his accountant wrote that he quote, had trouble conforming to rules and regulations, end quote, which is not surprising considering what he would do later on. In October of 2020, a lobster facility in New Edinburgh, Nova Scotia, owned by Thibault's company, Bay of Fundy Finest Seafood Distributors, was vandalized along with a van in front being set aflame. This incident occurred due to a dispute between members of the indigenous kmaq group, one of the groups that makes up the First Nations indigenous tribes in Nova Scotia, and non-indigenous lobster fishers over the right to fish in the area. And this issue has been a point of contention for many years now in Nova Scotia. The Supreme Court of Canada has declared that the Mi'kmaq group has the rights to lobster fish without a license, but this has angered many of the non-indigenous lobster fishers in the area, and this has led to constant clashes between the two factions, which oftentimes has become very violent, with shootings and arsons. That same year that Thibault had his business vandalized, he was fined $20,000 for environmental damages relating to $58,000 worth of lobster that he had sold that had not been disclosed to the Department of Fisheries. In 2023, Thibault was charged with making threats to a lobster fisherman who was looking to change buyers. In November of 2024, Thibault, along with his son Zachary, were arrested after they were charged with intimidation and the threatening of lobster buyer Geoffrey Jobert, owner of restaurant Lobster Hub Inc., who had decided he was only going to buy lobster from licensed harvesters rather than ones linked to Nova Scotia's First Nations that were accused of fishing outside the commercial season. Just days before Thibault and his son threatened Jobert, Jobert had his house targeted by gunfire. A year earlier, a semi-truck parked on the property adjacent to Jobert's processing plant was set aflame after its tires were filled with gasoline. Thibault was released on bail in December of 2024, but just months later he was arrested again, this time accused of hiring 2 men to extort $10,000 from a fisherman. Thibault was released on bail a couple of weeks after that arrest. Him and the other co-accused were arrested and charged last week for several charges of fishing lobster during a closed season without a license and for selling the illegally caught lobster. They were also charged with cocaine trafficking, with police seizing from them cocaine and digital scales along with multiple firearms and financial documents. Also raided that day was Thibault's employer, Wedgeport Lobsters. Thibault was also charged with 2 counts of intimidation of an undercover police officer deployed to gather incriminating evidence against him. Thibault, a lover of fast cars, was driving the undercover cop in his Lamborghini at more than 120 miles per hour on a highway, refusing to slow down after the cop asked to get out. Also charged last week was once again his son Zachary, who was charged with intimidation and extortion. The 2 other arrested individuals, Dean Stewart and Raymond Scott, face charges that include cocaine trafficking, intimidation, and arson. Eric Thibault has been denied bail after being arrested last week for his most recent charges. He is next due to appear in court on December 10th. But an interesting story concerning organized crime in a region of Canada that is often not highlighted very much at all. Canadian organized crime often focuses focuses on Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia. You almost never hear anything about organized crime going on in Nova Scotia, and it's particularly interesting that this form of illicit activity surrounds the lobster industry. It shouldn't be that surprising though, because Nova Scotia does supply almost half of the lobsters sold in Canada. It's $1 billion plus industry, so I guess it shouldn't be surprising that there's illegal activities going on with the region's most lucrative industry. To me, I'm curious how the cocaine trafficking charges against this group pertains to the lobster industry. Thibault has long been accused of extortion and violence relating to lobster fishing, but this is the first that has come out that he is involved in the cocaine trade. I'm interested to see how exactly that worked. I'm wondering if he was able to use his connections on the sea to bring in cocaine to Nova Scotia. I also find it interesting that against all these criminal allegations, there is the backdrop of Indigenous and non-Indigenous lobster fishermen fighting for the right to control who gets to fish in the area. And it seems like darker elements are able to exploit this conflict for financial gain, such as Eric Thibault did. But violence in Nova Scotia's lobster industry has been ongoing since 2020. I'm curious to see how this issue evolves and if other men besides Eric Thibault will try to infiltrate the lobster industry with the use of violence and intimidation. But an interesting story that highlights the illicit dealings going on in an otherwise completely legitimate industry. And it just goes to show that no matter how lucrative an industry, organized crime will always look to infiltrate however they can, and very often they succeed, such as the case with Eric Thibault and his Canadian Lobster Mafia. All right, that's going to do it for this week's edition of Organized Crime News Weekly. Thank you so much for tuning in. Just want to remind everyone to please like, share, and subscribe so we can help grow this channel. Also, please make sure to support my channel. You can do that by just contributing $2.99 a month. Any contribution is greatly appreciated, and it helps me to continue making these videos. I'll be back next week to report on more stories concerning the global criminal underworld. Thank you so much for tuning in.